This is a picture of the Narmer Palette, which is supposedly the palette created by the first king to unite Upper and Lower Egypt, the start of Egyptian civilization. The conventional argument is that you have this Egyptian civilization springing almost full grown out of a series of little villages up and down the Nile, basically Neolithic, proto-Egyptian villages, and then suddenly we have this civilization. Now, the late, great John Anthony West, whom I had the immense privilege of meeting and talking with John Anthony West, he wrote a book called Serpent in the Sky. In Serpent in the Sky, John Anthony West says this conventional timeline of ancient Egyptian civilization is ludicrous. It's just impossible. He writes, quote, Egyptologists postulate an indeterminate and indeterminable period of, quote, development prior to the First Dynasty. This assumption is supported by no evidence. Indeed, the evidence, such as it is, appears to contradict the assumption. He goes on to say that Egypt was, quote, a civilization which, supposedly starting from a crude Neolithic base, produced in a few centuries a complete system of hieroglyphs, the most sophisticated calendrical system ever developed, an effective mathematics, a refined medicine, a total mastery of the gamut of arts and crafts, and the capacity to construct the largest and most accomplished stone buildings ever built by man. The cautiously expressed astonishment of modern Egyptologists hardly matches the real magnitude of the mystery. And throughout that book, he shows that Egyptian civilization just starts basically from nowhere and has a complete system. There's no development period whatsoever. And he finishes this discussion that I'm quoting by saying, quote, Egypt did not develop her civilization, but inherited it, end quote. And you can find that on pages 196 to 197 of Serpent in the Sky by John Anthony West. So in order to show this Narmer Palette, it's like the first oldest tablet we have from Egypt. In order to show that this is supposedly just the first manifestation of dynastic Egypt. It just pops out of nowhere. What John Anthony West is arguing is that is an impossible narrative, but that's still what's being taught. And I'm going to provide some evidence that shows that John Anthony West is 100% right. What is being displayed here is something that Egypt inherited. This is the very earliest known First Dynasty Pharaoh, Narmer, and he's using symbology, which is celestial. It's part of a ancient celestial system, and I'm going to show that it is worldwide. And in order to do that, I'm going to go to a different piece of artwork and start there, showing how it's celestial, and then you'll see how these pieces of art from the very first dynasty of ancient Egypt are also based on that exact same system, and we're going to see it echoed around the world. So the conventional storyline is this just popped into existence in Egypt, and they started using this system. Well, if they just started using this type of artwork and this type of symbology, how did it pop up in all these other civilizations around the world using the exact same system? We'll talk about that. Here's one more illustration. You can see the parallels to the Narmer Palette. This is from King Den, also a First Dynasty king of Egypt. We'll talk about what is going on in this illustration, but these tablets from earliest Egypt show us yet more evidence of what John Anthony West was arguing. He wasn't using this star myth system, but the star myth system that I'm researching and that I've been writing about for the past 15 years provides still more support over and above all the archaeological evidence that Egypt and all these other civilizations around the world inherited a more ancient system from somewhere. So let's take a look at an artifact that was only revealed to the world in 2017, in November of 2017, in fact. This is known as the Pylos agate, or the Pylos combat agate. It was shown to the world in 2017, and I immediately saw that it was based on this same pattern of celestial metaphor that I'd been writing about already and publishing books about. And I've got a whole video that I did back in 2017. You can go find it on YouTube, called the Pylos combat agate among the celestial realms. It's sometimes called the Pylos combat agate because this scene of combat on the Pylos agate. It was found in a tomb that was just discovered in 2015 or 2016, but it had been undisturbed. An undisturbed tomb in Pylos, which is in Greece, on the Peloponnese Peninsula of Greece. On the western side, near Pylos, this tomb was discovered in an olive orchard of a young warrior in his 30s. His bones were still there, along with 3,000 artifacts. And this particular artifact, the Pylos agate, was so encrusted with deposits, mineral deposits, it took them a couple of years to clean it off before they showed it to the public in 2017. But that grave, they determined, because it had bones in it, that it was sealed off in 1500 BC or BCE. So that's 3,500 years ago from the year 2000. 1500 BC, that's 1,000 years before classical Greece. And so it's thought that this cylinder seal might be Minoan. This artifact itself might be Minoan in its origin, from the Minoan civilization. But the Pylos combat agate is amazing artwork on an incredibly small surface, on a very hard stone, agate. And this whole artifact is only 3.5 centimeters all the way across. So it's very small. Here's a comparison to a US 25-cent piece or a quarter. You can see how small this piece of artwork is, but the incredible detail is so intricate and so accurate and so artistic that the researchers who found it said this should completely change the way we view prehistoric art, because this is so ancient. We don't know when it was made, sometime before 1500 BC. Nobody thought that anybody could produce this type of an artifact that long ago. In fact, some of the details are smaller in size than the width of a human hair. And so some conventional archaeologists have speculated, did they have some kind of optics, some kind of magnifying capability? If so, that means they were able to do ground glass to magnify to come up with this kind of precision artwork. But most astonishing aspect of the Pylos combat agate to me is that it very obviously shows a celestial scene that uses celestial conventions that we can find around the world. I'm just going to point out some of them very rapidly before we get back to the seals from ancient Egypt and see how they're using this exact same convention. Those are even more ancient, possibly, than this one. But let's take a look at the celestial features in this artwork. You can see the man at the top brandishing a sword over his head with his leg extended. I've shown this quite extensively in other videos, so I'm just going to briefly show it here. Here's the stars near the Milky Way, and at the top of your screen you see the outline of a constellation that also has the rear leg extended and brandishing a weapon overhead while reaching out with the other arm. And that constellation is the constellation we know as Hercules. You can find imagery of Hercules in this exact same posture from around 500 BC in classical Greece, in classical Greek pottery. Look at the parallels, the rear leg extended, the deep lunge posture, the sword or other weapon brandished overhead, and then reaching forward with the other hand. Now, just below Hercules is a constellation called Ophiuchus. We won't get too much into Ophiuchus today because I want to really focus on the parallels to Hercules, but that figure below the man who's brandishing the sword is a spearman. Ophiuchus, just below Hercules, is often associated with the weapon of a spear or sometimes two spears, and you can see why, because Ophiuchus is a constellation that it means the serpent holder, and on either side are two serpent halves, but if you drew a line through those in a straight line, it would look like a spear or even two spears. So Ophiuchus is the spearman in this picture, and then below Ophiuchus, there's a couple constellations that could represent the slain figure that's on the ground beneath the other two figures. In this case, it's almost certainly associated with Sagittarius. Directly below Ophiuchus is Scorpio, so sometimes a slain figure below Ophiuchus would be Scorpio. In this case, the arm overhead indicates that this is a Sagittarius figure, and you can see it's a little bit to one side of Ophiuchus. But the positioning here of Hercules, Ophiuchus, and Sagittarius shows us very clearly that this is artwork that is based on these constellations in the heavens. And that might be a bit of a stretch to argue if the ancient artist in this artwork did not include some details that absolutely confirm that we're looking at these specific constellations. Now, if you look at the swordsman in the Pylos agate, you can see his extended front arm is grasping this arcing crest coming out of the helmet of the spearman. That arc-shaped crest is in front of Hercules and above Ophiuchus. And in the sky, if you look above Ophiuchus and in front of Hercules, you can see this constellation, the northern crown. It's very distinctive in the sky. It's a beautiful arc of stars. And you can imagine Hercules with that outstretched front arm actually reaching out and grasping the northern crown, just as the artwork shows the swordsman brandishing his sword over his head is reaching out and grasping this crest. But that's not all. There's also, if you look at the swordsman on his hip by that extended rear leg, you can see he's got like a scabbard for his sword, and at the end of the scabbard is a ball, like a big knob at the end of the scabbard that's sticking out from his hip. And in the night sky, on the other side of Hercules, above the hip, on the other side from the northern crown, is a very bright star known as Vega. That star Vega is positioned in the correct position to indicate that ball on the end of the scabbard of the swordsman in this artwork. So we've got enough confirmatory evidence to conclude beyond any doubt that what we're dealing with here is a celestial scene, because the artwork itself contains references to other celestial features in the sky that show that this is where this scene comes from. And I'll just show a Hercules image from a vase from about 530 BC, and you can see the same posture. In this case, Hercules is brandishing a club, but he's got the extended rear leg, and he's reaching out to grasp the crest of the Amazon warrior that he has vanquished here. You can see the arc-shaped crest in the artwork from 530 BC featuring Hercules or Heracles. Also, you can see he's got this lion skin over his head and then around his body, and the tail of the lion has that tuft that indicates the star Vega. That's what I'm arguing, is that's where that comes from. That convention is connected to the heavens. Now, let me show you one more piece of artwork even later to help show that Sagittarius is the vanquished warrior on the ground. This is from a painting from the 1600s by Salvatore Rosa. It's called Jacob's Vision. You can see it's the vision of Jacob's ladder, but there at the base of Jacob's ladder, you can see Jacob is asleep, and he's in the exact same posture with one arm flung over his head. And Jacob's ladder is also based on this same part of the sky. You can see the Milky Way in the painting, the cloudy path of the Milky Way that the artist has positioned there next to Jacob's ladder. Here's the night sky. There's the Milky Way that we talked about. There's where Sagittarius is positioned in relative to the Milky Way. There's Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus in this case is actually in the painting. The artist has made a mountain or a hill in the position of Ophiuchus on the other side of the Milky Way from Sagittarius. And then going up through the Milky Way, that's the angels ascending and descending in the vision of Jacob. You can see the sets of angels. Some are going up, some are coming down in the painting. So in between Sagittarius and Ophiuchus, we have the Milky Way. You can see the cloudy path of the Milky Way in the painting. And then you've got these winged figures going up and down the Milky Way. That's these two very large birds of the Milky Way in the night sky, the constellation Aquila, the eagle, and Cygnus, the swan. Aquila looks like it's flying upwards. Cygnus looks like it's flying downwards. So all I'm showing is that this convention of the arm thrown over the head and the way that Jacob appears to be wearing like almost a dress or a skirt. Look over at the outline of Sagittarius, and you can see that Jacob is not only in the position of Sagittarius relative to the Milky Way, relative to Ophiuchus, and relative to those two great birds of the Milky Way, but the artist has depicted Jacob using conventions that connect with Sagittarius. That plume on top of the head of Sagittarius is depicted in the painting as an arm flung over his head in sleep. And if you go back to the Pylos combat agate, you'll see that the fallen warrior is in almost the exact same posture as Jacob, even though this painting is from the 1600s AD, and the Pylos combat agate is from the 1500s or earlier BC. So let's now go to those tablets from ancient Egypt that conventional history wants to tell us. Just the very first kings of Egypt, when they united Upper and Lower Egypt and established the First Dynasty, they just started using these conventions. And these conventions are found around the world, and they are related to the stars. This is the tablet of King Den. He was a First Dynasty Pharaoh, and he's thought to have ruled around 3000 BC. That's 5,000 years ago. But look, his outstretched arm is reaching out for an arc-shaped, there's an arc shape just in front of his outstretched arm, just like in the Pylos combat agate, just like we saw in the sky in front of Hercules, the northern crown. And King Den is also depicted with this long sash hanging down like a tail off of his hip, just like we saw in the Pylos combat agate, where I showed the connection to the star Vega in the sky. So these conventions are already ingrained in the very first dynasty artwork. And here's the cartouche that shows that it's King Den. This is why we know that it's King Den. There's this falcon on top of a rectangle. The falcon is the god Horus. That's how conventional Egyptologists tell us. Sometimes they even say his name was Horus Den, because on top of the cartouche is the god Horus, with whom the pharaohs are associated. And then in that rectangle, there's a hand. That's the Egyptian hieroglyph for the sound D, just like at the beginning of my name, that hand. And then there's a wavy line representing water. That's the sound N. So basically we have a Horus falcon, a hand for a D, and a wavy line for an N. And so it's Horus Den. We don't actually know the vowels that they use. So we call him King Den, but nobody knows exactly how it was pronounced. And then below that, you have some vertical lines. Those represent the palace, the actual pillars of the palace. And so this was the original form of a pharaoh's cartouche, where they put the name of the king or pharaoh inside of a rectangle or an oval later on, because it's representing the palace. So that's how we know that's King Den. Now let me go to the Narmer Palette. This is the Narmer Palette. King Narmer is thought to have lived around 3200 BC, so even earlier than King Den. There is a king list from the time of King Den, which lists the pharaohs of the First Dynasty. And in it, it starts with King Narmer, and then Hor-Aha, and then King Jur, and then after King Jur came King Hor-Jet, and then came Hor-Den, or King Den, that we were just talking about. And then also on the same king list from the reign of King Den, there's a queen mentioned, Merit Neith. It's thought that she might have been the first female pharaoh or first queen of Egypt. We're not sure of any of this. This is the First Dynasty. It's very ancient. There's not that much to go on, but supposedly these kings just pop out of nowhere and start making these tablets. And the very first king, King Narmer, has his name inscribed on both of these sides of the tablet. There's a symbol of the palace, and then there's the symbol of a fish and the symbol of a chisel, and that's the name of Narmer. But if you look at the Narmer palette, you can see very clearly that we are dealing with the exact same pattern that I just showed was celestial using the Pylos combat agate. Now let's see it in the Narmer palette. And I'm just going to focus on the side of the Narmer palette that shows this smiting scene. It's so common in ancient Egypt that the king smiting his enemies has been given the name of a smiting scene. We also saw it in the tablet of King Den. But take a look and you can see that Narmer is striding. He's in a striding posture, and he's brandishing basically a mace over his head. It's like a club with a ball at one end. Clearly consistent with what we've seen of the constellation Hercules. If you look closely, you'll see that Narmer is wearing this long sash. Just like we saw, there's this indication of a convention where Hercules figures have a long sash that I argue points towards the constellation Lyra and its brightest star Vega. That's what we saw from the Pylos combat agate. In these palettes from the First Dynasty, the sash is just hanging down at their side, but you can see it's a rather long sash. It's almost like this convention came from connecting to Vega, and then the kings were wearing this sash, and the artist doesn't even necessarily make it point towards Vega in all of the artwork, although we'll see that in some artwork it definitely does. And then on his outstretched front arm, just above it, we see these little lotus plants popping up out of a kind of a anthropomorphic figure, but there's 6 little lotus plants arranged in an arc. Now remember, right in front of the constellation Hercules, we find the northern crown. And let me show you how many stars are outlined in this. This is from the free online open source planetarium Stellarium. And That's how they outline the northern crown. Let's count the stars there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's 6 little lotuses in the Narmer Palette, and there's 6 stars in the northern crown, the way it's outlined here on Stellarium. Now, I actually usually include one more star in the northern crown. If you look very closely, I'll circle it right now, there's a 7th star right there. It's a little farther from, the ones down at the bottom are very closely clustered. This one's a little farther away. Now look back at the Narmer Palette. You can see that there's a falcon standing above this arc and putting a rope right through the nose of this human figure. And I would argue there you've got your 7th star of the northern crown, because they all make a perfect arc. And you might say, well, yeah, they're arcing downwards in the Narmer Palette, but the northern crown, the arc is opening upwards. Well, if you look at the falcon Horus, who has that rope through the nose there, that actually arcs a little bit in the more correct direction. But I think you can see very clearly that in the Narmer Palette, we've got the same posture, brandishing a weapon with the sash, and in front of the outstretched arm, or very nearby it, we've got an arc, just like we find in the sky. Now, when we look at the constellation Hercules, and I draw that line going up to Vega, you might think it almost looks like a tail. Over in the civilization of India, also very ancient, we find the god Hanuman, and he does have a tail. And look, he's depicted in the same posture. This is from a statue of Hanuman that is still being anointed by worshipers. They're putting different substances on it and even a flower on top of it during certain days that are special to Hanuman. But you can see Hanuman is in that same posture, and he's got his tail arcing over his head. In fact, it doesn't just go up to the star Vega, it arches over his head, so it connects to basically where the weapon would be in the sky. But look at his other hand. He's actually holding an arc shape. If you look closely in his forward hand, there's an arc shape. What it is actually Hanuman is usually shown wearing a big wreath of flowers, like a Hawaiian lei, of flowers. And that wreath of flowers goes all the way around, but it arcs right there in his hand. I'll outline it so you can see in the statue. You can see both the posture and the arc shape. He's got one hand overhead, even though he's not carrying a weapon. Hanuman does sometimes carry a weapon in some of the depictions of Hanuman. This is from a manuscript showing Hanuman, and you can see over his shoulder, he's carrying a club. And in his outstretched arm, in this case, he's carrying a flower. Why is he carrying a flower? I don't think that's the northern crown. In this case, that flower is from a different constellation. Here's Hercules with that distinctive posture. You can see in both cases, Hanuman with his tail is in the same posture as Hercules. There's the sash that comes up from the hip of Hercules figures going to Vega, but in this case it could look like the tail of the monkey-headed god Hanuman. But you can see why Hanuman carries a club. Look at Hercules. Sometimes that could be a sword, sometimes it could be a club, sometimes it could be a mace, as we saw in the seal of King Den and the Narmer Palette. And in this case, Hanuman is plucking a flower. If you look down below Hercules, we talked a little bit about the constellation Ophiuchus. The central body of Ophiuchus is flanked by the 2 serpent halves. His name means the serpent holder. On one side is the serpent's tail. That's on the left of our screen. On the other side is the serpent's head. Well, the serpent's head, look at how Hercules is reaching down towards the serpent's head. So in this instance of Hanuman, instead of grasping a crest or an arc-shaped object or an arc-shaped curve in his necklace, he's plucking a flower. That flower is the top of the serpent head of Ophiuchus. And I've done other videos where I show that lotus flower that grows out of the navel of Lord Vishnu when he's sleeping on the back of the multi-headed serpent is this very same part of the constellation Ophiuchus. So there's plenty of evidence that that's the flower. I'm just showing that here in India, we've got Hanuman figures. Instead of having a sash, they've got a tail, but they're in the same posture. And the civilization of India is extremely ancient. The Vedas of ancient India, it's argued about how ancient they are, but they're at least as old as 1500 BC. That's conventional timeline says they were probably written down around 1500 BC, but they had a very intricate way of passing them down orally where they had to be memorized syllable by syllable. And so that oral tradition could go back, we don't know how far it goes back, but here again, a very ancient source, the Vedas, ancient India, and we've got the gods of ancient India are using this celestial system. Here's another statue of Hanuman. It's a more recent statue, but I put it here to show his tremendous mace. Sometimes it looks like a club, like in the picture on the right, but more commonly, it's a mace with a big, wide part at the top, just like in the Pharaoh images that we were looking at. And you can see in this case, Hanuman, he's got the mace over one shoulder, and then he's got his outstretched arm opposite the mace. In this case, he's holding up a mountaintop. That's from a story of Hanuman. Instead of reaching down to pluck a flower, he was actually sent to get an herb off of the tallest mountain in the Himalayas, or in the Himalaya range. He had to find this particular flower to have a medicine to save somebody. And when he went there, he didn't know which flower to pick, so he just brought back the whole top of the mountain. Well, if you look down below Hercules, this is important for some of the things that I'm going to continue to show as we go around the world with this pattern. Down below Hercules, the top of Ophiuchus is a triangular looking mountaintop. Ophiuchus is often associated with mountains. As we saw in that 1600s painting on the other side of the Milky Way, the artist had put a mountain that was shaped like Ophiuchus. In this story of Hanuman, he couldn't find the flower, so he just brought back the whole mountaintop. That's because Ophiuchus, which looks like a mountain, is just below Hercules, which Hanuman is associated with the constellation Hercules. So sometimes he plucks a flower, sometimes he picks up the whole top of the mountain, as he does in this statue and as he does in that story. Here's one more image of Hanuman, and I put it here because it's so clearly a smiting scene. Once again, we've got Hanuman. He's facing in the opposite direction from Hercules. Sometimes the artist just takes artistic license and reverses it, but clearly he's in that exact same posture. You can see he's got big long necklaces around his neck, but look, he's got his tail sticking out, pointing towards the star Vega. He's brandishing a mace over his head, and he's holding down this vanquished opponent by the horns, or it looks like horns coming out of the head of his vanquished opponent. Those are the arc-shaped horns of this demon or asura that Hanuman is defeating in this smiting scene. But you can see that smiting scene is almost identical to the smiting scenes of ancient Egypt. Here's the seal from King Den again. You can see King Den's got a mace. He's in the same posture. He's got a long tail attached to his waist, and he's got an arc-shaped something coming out of his hand. So these conventions are based on the stars, but they're showing up in cultures, not just in ancient Egypt. They seem to have popped up in ancient India too. So did King Den and King Narmer just dream this up, and then in other parts of the world they started doing smiting scenes using the exact same patterns from the heavens? What's going on here? Let's dig a little bit deeper and go a little bit further and cross the oceans to the Americas. Now this is a vessel from the Maya civilization. The Maya civilization, also very ancient. There are civilizations in the Americas that are quite ancient, and they're showing these exact same conventions. This is a piece of art, a tumbler. It's often referred to as a tumbler. It's like a cup, and it's in the Met Museum today in New York City. It was found in southern Mexico or Guatemala and is dated to the 7th or 8th century AD or CE. So that means the 600s or the 700s, well before Columbus. And yet look at the outline of chalk. I've talked a lot about this. I've made full videos about this as well, so I'm just going to go briefly through it. This is a god named Chalk. I've put his name up at the top. It's sometimes spelled a couple of different ways. He is a rain god. This is the description that you can find in the Met Museum and on their website, talking about the god Chalk. He's a rain god, and they describe his posture as, this elegant, graceful posture that he's in, mid-stride, lifting off his left foot, extending his right leg in front of him. He's in the exact posture of the constellation Hercules. And we'll see what a perfect match it is. But down at the bottom it says, look, in one hand, he's holding a big axe. He's brandishing an axe over his shoulder with one hand, and then with the other hand, he's reaching out in front of him, and it says he's grasping an animate stone, this circular disc object. They don't really know what it is, so they call it an animate stone, as if it's like alive. Well, what is that? What's right in front of Hercules? Let's take a look. Oh, it's the northern crown, which is an arc, and it's in the exact right position for Chalk to be reaching out his hand and grasping it. I've moved the image of Chalk off of the vase down below Hercules so you can really see it. And now let's bring in the stars, and you can see the artist of this vase or this tumbler has depicted Chalk in the exact posture of the constellation Hercules, and he's reaching out and grasping this disc-shaped object, which is in the exact position of the northern crown. You can see how closely it matches where the northern crown is in the sky. But not only that, we can also see that Chalk has this sash. We'll take a look at that in 1 second. There's one more piece of the description from the Met Museum. It says, the rain god actively engages with, in other words, it looks like he's fighting or battling or standing on top of a giant agnathous creature, likely the representation of a wheats, the spirit of a mountain. So remember, we saw the mountain below Hanuman, and in one legend, he actually brings the top of the mountain back. We can see that over and over. Associated with Ophiuchus, below Hercules is a mountain. That's just another parallel. Around the world, these parallels based on the stars indicate a system that was going on before even the First Dynasty of ancient Egypt. And let's just look at the waistband of Chalk, and he's got a long tail depending or descending from that right here with a tuft at the end of it, a lot like Hercules with the lion's tail, but this is like it's almost like a cloth around the waist of the god Chalk. And once again, it matches exactly with, or it's definitely pointing towards the region of Lyra above the hip of Hercules, just like we saw in the Pylos combat agate, and just as we saw in those images from the Narmer Palette and King Den on the McGregor seal, the so-called McGregor seal in the British Museum. So, what am I driving at? What's going on here is the very first kings or pharaohs of the very first dynasty of ancient Egypt, who supposedly just come out of nowhere and start this civilization, the First Dynasty, are exhibiting in their artwork a pattern that we find literally around the world. Here's a map of the world. Of course, there's Egypt right there. Here's where the tumbler, or the Maya drinking vessel with chalk, is from this region, southern Mexico, modern day southern Mexico, Guatemala. We've got chalk and King Den, and they're clearly using the same symbology. They're using this same posture as the constellation Hercules. They're brandishing over their head a weapon. In one case, it's a mace. In one case, it's an axe. And then they're reaching out with their other arm towards some kind of an arc shape or a disc. Also on the Narmer tablet, we saw the arc shape of the lotus plants coming up above the outstretched arm. These patterns are not a coincidence. Now, we should also point out that Egypt and southern Mexico also have enormous pyramids. Here's a great pyramid on the Egypt side and the Pyramid of the Sun in Mexico on the Maya side from Central America. And what you may not have been told, you don't hear this very often, but the ratio of the height of the Great Pyramid to the perimeter of its base is 2 pi. So the number pi, an extremely important number, it's an infinite number, and so it has connections to infinity. Pi is encoded in the Great Pyramid. Pi is encoded in the ratio of the height to the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid. If you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 2 pi, you get the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid. And with the Pyramid of the Sun in modern-day Mexico, it is also related to pi. Obviously, it's not as steep as the Great Pyramid. It's more wide than it is tall. So if you multiply the height of the Pyramid of the Sun by 4 pi, you get the base perimeter. But these two pyramids from Egypt and from Central America incorporate pi in the ratio of their height to their base. So what we're seeing here are connections around the world. These are connections from archaeology, but now we can also see, once we start to understand the celestial codes that I've been researching and writing about for all these years, we can see there's other connections. These are undeniable connections. You can't explain these away. But how did the Maya, with their cup showing the god Chak reaching out for an arc that's in the position of the northern crown, and he's got a tuft that's in the position of Vega, how did they get those conventions in Mexico? And these same conventions that supposedly just the First Dynasty kings just pulled them out of the air, never been used before. Did the Egyptians travel around and give it to the Maya? Probably not. I'm not arguing that. I don't think they were actually traveling around to the Maya, but if they were, then I guess they had to travel around to India too, because there we found the same smiting scene with the images of Hanuman that I've been showing are based on the same constellations. Now, obviously, it would be easier to get from Egypt to India than from Egypt to Mexico. What I'm saying is, I don't think Egypt was spreading this around the world. That is a possibility, but it's not the most likely possibility. It's also not very likely that this convention, this system, based on the stars, just popped up in Egypt and popped up in the Maya civilization and popped up in the ancient gods and myths of India and on around the world. I can show this on and on around the world independently. Like they just randomly all hit upon the exact same conventions. It's it's actually very difficult to see the constellation Hercules in the sky. The Northern Crown is easy to see, but for all these different cultures to outline it the same way and then to come up with smiting scenes the same way, I think what is much more likely is, as John Anthony West said in the quotation that I started with, ancient Egypt and all these other ancient cultures around the world did not, quote, develop their civilization or these systems, they inherited them. These conventions in the way that they do their artwork and depict their gods is part of some even more ancient system, so ancient that the ancient civilizations that we know of, when they first start out, they're already using this system. So I call it the deep ancient. It's much more likely to me, rather than to posit that Egypt was just going around and spread it. They started it with King Den and King Narmer, and then they spread it around the world somehow. It's much more likely an inheritance from a more ancient time that I call the deep ancient. And that deep ancient culture may have already been so ancient that it was forgotten, largely forgotten by the time the ancient civilizations came along, but they were the inheritors or preservers of this deep ancient system. They may have been separated from the deep ancient time by some type of catastrophe that happened to separate, to keep, but they trying to preserve its memory. And they all acknowledge, yes, there was a time even before us, a time of the gods, and we're the inheritors of that. But today, conventional scholarship denies the possibility of a deep ancient culture, even in the face of all this evidence. This evidence is absolutely overwhelming that around the world, all these most ancient civilizations that we know of, when they spring into existence, are already using a mythology system that is based on the stars and that is based on the same foundations, and yet around the world, it's already got all these different variants. We've got Hanuman over in India. We've got chalk over in the Maya civilization. They're all very different. The sashes on the waists of King Den and King Narmer are hanging straight down, whereas they're kind of pointing out towards Vega in the Hanuman, in the chalk, and in the Pylos combat agate. It's as if this system is already so ancient that it's already evolved and changed into different forms, but with a still recognizable foundation that comes from a time even more ancient than the earliest dynasties of ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt did not develop their civilization, they inherited it. They already have this system of hieroglyphs. As John Anthony West says, their hieroglyph system doesn't show any signs of evolution. It just springs fully formed in with these beautiful hieroglyphs, and then it doesn't change for thousands of years. Where's all the development of the hieroglyphs? So it's the same thing with these artwork. They're already showing this system is already fully developed by the time Narmer and Den are putting together the Narmer Palette and the McGregor tablet and putting that artwork on there, or their artists are creating these beautiful works of art. This system came from somewhere else, somewhere more ancient. And the evidence is absolutely overwhelming, and it's worldwide. So I'm very excited that we have an opportunity to go to Egypt and see this artwork in person. I'm going to be participating in Stars Over Egypt with my partner and wife, Ksenia Moore, and we're going to Egypt this November to meet up with Patricia Alyan Lehman, who lives in Egypt and has been studying all this and has access to all these sites. We have private tours of sites that we're going to have special access to. I'm sure we'll be seeing artwork that I've never even seen pictures of before, and we'll see, oh, wait, that is probably based on the stars, or we'll hear Patricia's knowledge about ancient Egypt. We have to reserve the special access to these locations for our November tour by July. So if we don't get enough signups by early July, then we'll have to postpone this trip. But if we do get enough signups by early July, then we'll keep the sign-up period open. So if you're interested in our Stars Over Egypt tour this November to go see this incredible ancient civilization and learn more about it with me and Ksenia. So I really hope that you can join us in Egypt for the Stars Over Egypt tour. Like I said, if you want to express your interest in that, please go to my website to the events page, and there's a link there that will take you to the Stars Over Egypt sign up. Indicate your interest. We need to have those indications of interest by the first week of July, and I hope to see you there. Thank you so much.